Thanks for joining us. I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. I'm your host here for Breaking Culture Live. And I am the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association. I'm broadcasting on the north side of Chicago. As always, thanks for joining us for this experiment in scholarly communication, where we chat with activists and academics breaking down the breaking news. So today I'm really grateful to be joined by the authors and advocates behind the book Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. The book debunks the most prominent myths about trans athletes through scientific research, statistical data, and a rich ethnographic interviews with 20 trans athletes. It's an excellent resource that tells important stories we don't hear enough. So the authors of that book are Dr. Anna Baeth, who's the feminist scholar whose work blends empirical research, innovative theory, and a reimagined narrative. For a decade, she's explored the gendering of sports spaces, the moving body, and sports' cultural role in social movements. Thanks for joining us, Anna.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Ellie Roscher is the author of Fair Game, Remarkable Rose, The Embodied Path, 12 Tiny Things, Play Like a Girl, and How Coffee Saved My Life, which I also endorse. Ellie teaches writing and yoga in Minneapolis. Thanks for joining us, Ellie.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And Chris Mosier is a trailblazing athlete, coach, and founder of transathlete.com, the go-to resource source on transgender inclusion in sports. He made history as the first openly trans man on the U.S. men's national team and helped change International Olympic Committee policy for trans athletes. A Nike-sponsored athlete, Chris is a 5-time national champion, a relentless advocate for trans rights. When not training and competing, he mentors transgender and non-binary athletes around the globe, living out his motto, to be who you needed when you were younger. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Let's go. Excited to be here.
Well, so this is a precipitous time for trans athletes. In addition to these sort of ever-present threat of trans sports bans at the state level, the cowardly compliance of major sports associations like the NCAA with transphobic policies, the Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments in a case that could result in the removal of Title IX protection from trans people in general. But this week, Swedish skier Ellis Lundholm became the first openly transgender athlete to compete in the Winter Olympics. He was forced to compete in the women's category despite identifying as male, but still, nonetheless, an important moment. One of the first statistics you note in the book is that despite all the news about trans athletes, few articles actually name or quote a trans athlete. I think you say 2% of the articles about trans athletes actually quote a trans athlete. Your book is a major exception to this, telling the stories of, again, over 28 trans athletes. So, but I want to talk more about that. But since Chris is not only a trans athlete, but founded an organization by that name, I want to start by asking him a question about that journey. You founded Trans Athlete in 2013, which was before the transgender tipping point in 2014. So, am I wrong in thinking that there was actually a more inclusive moment then than there is now?
Yeah. Well, let me first start off by saying I've never been on an interview or podcast with somebody who starts off with precipitous or cowardly compliance, which is now, I had to write it down. Cowardly compliance is like the phrase of this moment in terms of the way policymaking has been happening around trans people, not just in sports, but also in healthcare specifically, as we're seeing all of these bans or just cowardly compliance of people trying to not lose funding at hospitals under threats of this administration. So thank you for that strong lead in. So in 2013, I'd say 2013, when I started transathlete.com, was not the moment that we had, like a lot of inclusion in sports. In fact, I made that website because it was really difficult to find policies out there for trans people in sports. I came out as a transgender athlete in 2010, and part of me honestly just wanted to move to another state, make a new batch of friends, and just start my life as the man I knew that I am. And then another part of me saw this really great opportunity to be who I needed when I was younger, and to be a role model and somebody who was visible in sports, because when I came out, there were no other people who were competing in aligned gender at a high level, which is what I wanted to do. So really the website was born out of my own struggles of trying to transition categories in my sport and trying to get people to understand, like, what does it mean to be transgender as an athlete? What am I asking for in wanting to move from the women's category to the men's category, and how could they make that happen? And so the website then became a platform not just as a hub of resources and policies for people to find their sport policy, but it also became a way to leverage change in these organizations by saying, here's a great policy in this state. Maybe this is something that you, state that has no policy, could consider. And I was able to help get some traction on policies in that way. I would say, you mentioned the transgender tipping point around 2015, 2016. I made Team USA. Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine. Caitlyn Jenner came out. Chaz Bono was out. We started to get this social awareness around the topic of trans people, not necessarily in sports still, but there was a little bit more understanding. So, I think that, like so many social issues, it really is a pendulum. And I think that we got to a point where there was much more acceptance for trans people. The International Olympic Committee in 2022 released a fairness and inclusion document as their guidelines. We had an inclusive policy from 2015 at the Olympics, which then became, the gold standard, if you will,
Sure.
pun included, I guess. And other places and other organizations look to that policy, that inclusive policy at the highest level of sport, to say, if the Olympics are going to have a pathway for participation, then clearly our junior varsity high school team could too, right?
Sure.
And now we've seen from that progress, this has become a social issue, a political issue, more than a sports issue, and that's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like we're actually talking about sports at all, even if that's purportedly the topic. Um, I was There was another piece of this mosaic, is that at the beginning of the month, the British Journal of Sports Medicine published a meta study affirming all the things that advocates like you about inclusion, that you've long said this, and you've long talked about the possibility of having policies that express this fact about, especially about trans women athletes, right? Um, so I don't know as much about the origin of those earlier policies, but it seems like they were right all along. Uh, so I don't know if you have anything to say about that particular study, or about the studies that were there in advance. But
Yeah, I'll say so Dr. Anna Baeth here. I'll say first, I was fairly delighted that this piece was published in BJSM, because if you look at the track record of what has been published in that journal relative to the experiences of trans athletes, it's not great. That said, what the study concluded essentially is this myth that trans women are the same as cis men, and all cis men are bigger, faster, stronger than all cis women, is completely false. But what's interesting about that too is, to your point about kind of this moment of exclusion, when you look at the policies that were drafted prior to the last 3 years, and I'm thinking particularly about the IOC's policy, they did rely on certain studies that we talk a little bit about in this book, and in our next book we'll talk a lot more about it. But there were studies done in 2012, 2014 that really came to the same conclusion, which is there just is not enough evidence to justify exclusion. And the authors of those studies actually stated that publicly.
At
and
the time,
since
in
at the time,
2013, 2014.
yeah, and now those studies have been used to write exclusionary policies, which I find, I guess, darkly
Mystifying.
ironic. Well, also, I mean, for me as an academic, it's infuriating to think that somebody
Sure.
would take my research and when I'm outspoken about saying this should not be applied in this way, and then to throw that back in these authors' faces and say, actually, we are going to do that. What are we doing? This is not just counter to science, it's actually counter to the processes of the academy.
Yeah. And counter to the conclusions that were presented by academic authors who have actually studied this topic. Yeah, so and, the book takes on several of these major myths, and I appreciate also that you separated those two out. There is the myth about uh, sort of trans female athletes being the same as trans male athletes in terms of or no, a cis male, right? That this sort of slur that often gets used. But then also there's just the idea that all men, all cis men, are they perform better than all cis women, right? Which is another set of uh, kind of problematic assumptions that have all kinds of gendered baggage with them as well. But you take on a lot of these major myths, and you say that first there's a massive influx of trans athletes. The trans athletes, especially trans women, have a physiological advantage. The trans women are a threat to cis women, which this goes beyond sports and is more kind of part of that gateway to keeping people out of bathrooms and locker rooms and spaces in general. And then also that trans women are the greatest threat to gender equality in sports. So these are the sort of major myths that you talk about in the book. Maybe I don't know if you want to unpack any of those or dismantle them really briefly, but either way, like how have such bankrupt and unfounded myths taken root in the popular culture around trans athletes? Anyone can answer this, but so I know you've all had experience with this.
I'll start. So, one of the reasons it's taking root is because we have a scarcity model in women's sports. And if you look at the numbers in women's sports, they're still so embarrassingly low in terms of like how women get paid, women in leadership, women in media coverage. And so they're feeding this scarcity model. That's when fear can take hold is
Sure.
you have this little breadcrumb and trans athletes are going to take part of it. That's not what's happening.
Sure.
But it is inciting that fear. For a moral panic to happen, there has to be fear, and that fear takes hold because we don't have a security net in our society. And the right now, women's sports have fought so hard for this little tiny piece. But it's not about hoarding that. We're seeing that the states that are supportive of trans athletes, they have a higher participation rate of cis women, and those cis women say that they're having a better experience. And so I'm deeply, deeply invested in women's sports and girls and women being able to play. And it's abundantly clear in all of the myths that we debunk that trans athletes are not the problem. And so when you say it's not about sports, it's absolutely not about sports, but there's several things happening in society right now because there's so much vulnerability. That vulnerability is being tapped into, and who's winning with these lies are folks that want power and votes and are using this talking point to grow that moral panic that's absolutely just not based in reality.
You don't say as much as I understand that this is part of the topic of your next book, but you don't say as much about the forces spreading these myths. But if you could say like briefly, who's behind this? How come you gave a number? You said there are 85 times the number of anti-trans sports bills as there are trans women athletes. So I mean that's astounding, and I mean it would be kind of farcical if it wasn't so damaging, right? but what part do these myths play in that sort of atmosphere, and who's behind it?
Okay, so I think there are several groups behind it. But I think I do want to take a moment and go back to the previous question.
Sure.
Because I'm thinking a lot, we talk a lot about, it seems like everybody is talking about and making decisions about trans athletes without ever talking to trans athletes. And I really just want to underscore that, because I also think one of the major issues that we are facing right now culturally is isolation, social isolation. I think there's very extreme political polarization and isolation. And I think what we're seeing is active dehumanization. And so for me, part of this book and part of really drawing attention not just to how infrequently trans athletes are quoted or spoken about or spoken to in these conversations is about saying, okay, we need to actively start practicing rehumanization. We need to actively start socializing, getting away from isolation, because that is how all of these systems operate and how they continue to operate. And I do think there are specific people who are benefiting from that isolation. I won't get too deeply into capitalism and the corporations behind it. I think we've seen a lot of politicians gaining momentum. We've seen Riley Gaines earn a six-figure salary off of one talking point, one story. I mean, so there are people who are clearly benefiting. But ultimately, I would say one of the biggest issues is we have to learn how to talk to each other. We have to start having conversations that are grounded in humanity, and we can no longer remain silent on topics that matter.
And I think the "we" there is it's important to kind of unpack that, right? Because one of the you speak to several athletes who kind of go out of their way in much in the same way that, Chris, you talk about your sort of decision to not kind of move to another city, just basically uh, become the man that you feel you are, and not kind of go out of your way to advocate or educate, but just to kind of be stealth. And there are quite a few athletes that you have in the book who you interview who kind of they see themselves in this role as they need to be educators, they need to kind of build these bridges. But that's a lot of effort, that's a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of, I guess, putting yourself out there and risk. Um, uh, so it seems like there's also the cisgender responsibility that I think you kind of end on, right? That it's not just about kind of trans athletes need to put themselves out there; they need to be responsible for kind of educating everyone, but that this is part of what all of us need to, and us being sort of the cis society, the cis state in general, need to be kind of responsible for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not just numerically, right? And not just like whose body is on the line and whose body is not on the line, but I talk a lot about the how I grew as a person doing this project as a cisgender person. When I got to sit at the feet of transgender athletes and ask them to tell me the long version of their story, it was an invitation for me to turn inward and come out as cis, realize that I'm cisgender, and realize that we're in a decidedly cisgendered society and a decidedly cisgendered sports system, and that there's an ease in my body in navigating that. And that cis part of who I was fairly dormant. Like I was
Hmm.
taking it for granted, which is the definition of privilege. And privilege is a deadener. And so I was a little bit dead because I was taking that part of my identity for granted. And these trans athletes invited me to wake that part of me up and think about it and come out as cis as an active identity, I became more alive and more awake in who I am. And so then the step as an advocate became abundantly clear because I could see the water that I'm swimming in that is easeful for me, that is not for these folks. And I want to say also about this monster that is not true, that is being created, that is inciting fear and benefiting some people. One of the reasons we interviewed so many athletes is to not have a singular story, right?
Yeah.
That there's so much variety in our bodies, there's so much variety in our sports, and there's so much variety in these narratives. And don't we want that to be interesting, right? As a cis person, I want more variety, more diversity, more aliveness in my communities. So I'm not doing work for transgender inclusion because I'm a nice person and that's the right thing to do.
Sure.
Like it's very clear that my liberation is tied up in that.
Mm-hmm.
And we're inviting other cis folks to come out as cis and have that be an active identity where we see then the systems that we've created that are more easeful for certain bodies to navigate than others.
Well, and there's a theme that also runs through the book, which is that although, I mean, on top of that, a lot of these policies are not actually that beneficial for cis men or cis women, right? I mean, and and I like that you end with a quote about James Baldwin, talking about maybe cis people are just jealous of, of the joy or the liberation that people who are trans can feel instead of being kind of locked in that cis category. But even if you are comfortable in that, even if you do feel that privilege, it isn't always a benefit, right? There's the feeling that cis men have a certain kind of masculinity they have to perform. There's all sorts of cis femininity that you have to perform, and none of these are necessarily easeful or healthy.
Yeah, the myths are doing harm, but like so is our like very binary sports system. Like no one's winning right
Yeah.
now, right? And so this is a turning point moment where we can follow trans joy into a new future where every body moving
Hmm.
wins. And we should all be a little bit more invested in that. But as Baeth said, like that means we need to talk about money. And we need to talk about race as well as gender and sex.
Absolutely. Well, I want to come back to this getting rid of categories because I think that's where the book ends up, and I think that's like one of the most inspiring parts of it. But I also want to, I mean, you speak to all these athletes. I want to just hear a little bit about like how did you go about collecting these stories, and how have you been able to keep in touch with them? I mean, one of the stats that you mentioned is that when you started the interviews, all of the athletes were able to play in the states that they lived. And I mean, by the end of at least the introduction, only 4 were, and I don't know what the status is now, but how has that, have you been able to keep in touch with him? 1?
Only one can
Oh
currently
my
compete.
god. I mean, it's sort of it's like heartwarming and heartbreaking all at the same time as I read that book, because you tell these stories that are talking about how much fulfillment they have as athletes when they're playing. And then to hear that just makes me, it's just, yeah, it's heartbreaking. So have you been able to keep in touch with them or speak with them about that?
Chris, do you want to say?
Oh yeah. So for some of the youth athletes, particularly the youth athletes I interviewed and have relationships with, and many of those families have gone dark. They have either had to move states or they are just not responding to anything that would say in writing that their child is transgender, which is, really an insight into this moment. We talked about dehumanization earlier, and sport has been used to dehumanize us, but this sort of pile-on effect of all of these other policies and bills that are being implemented, that are even being debated. We could be in states with great inclusive policies, but for a conservative lawmaker to introduce a sports ban that maybe has no chance of passing, right? The rhetoric that it comes out of our government and our lawmakers debating, quote unquote, debating whether or not people like me should have access to the sports like our cisgender peers is devastating. I mean, it is the mental health impact of being told that you don't belong, that you are less than, that you don't deserve the same rights or opportunities as your peers is something that, as an adult is difficult to manage, but as a parent of a kid experiencing this, I can't even imagine. So yeah, we've been in touch with some of the athletes who are continuing to find joy in sports through other ways that are just not organized sports. Because as an athlete, this is who we are. This is in our bodies. This is how we express ourselves. It's the place that we feel like home, and it's where we find our friends in our community. It's where we find our people. And I think, like you said, it's both heartbreaking and heartwarming. The heartwarming piece of this is that so many athletes or parents of these athletes have been able to find opportunities that are less structured, but still affirming for sort of a alternate for them. But the fact remains that the being excluded from the real opportunities of playing alongside your peers, is just incredibly heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, although the book is about sports, in that sense, it's also about gender affirming care. It's about inclusion. I mean, many of the athletes that you interview, that's part of this journey that they go through, and sort of like, and each one of them is unique. Each one of them is different, and I think that that helps to kind of challenge the singular story, as you mentioned. But part of it also kind of reminded me of I was listening to an interview that NPR did with Leah Thomas last fall, and it seemed to track with a lot of the processes of I guess the journeys of these athletes. Right, on the one hand, she really felt this deep sense of peace, a sense of what in many of the stories you talk about athletes calling like a flow state. Like they kind of just get into this space where everything falls away. They can kind of be in their bodies. For her, it's swimming, but for others, it's maybe it's biking, maybe it's even playing football. There's all sorts of different sports that these athletes are playing. Uh, but then she also feels this sense of dysphoria in her body. But she's sort of like in a way given liberation by these inclusive policies of the NCAA at the time that allow her to begin her transition and still kind of continue to compete. And there's a quote that I just want to read. She's talking about, in a way, it kind of addresses these myths too. She says, the biggest difference between my swimming that year that she had, finally was able to swim, as a woman, versus beginning before transitioning, was how much more engaged I was in the sport. I was way, way weaker. This goes to those myths. My muscle mass had decreased so much, and I had way less endurance. But I could put my full energy into swimming again because I wasn't putting most of it into dissociating just so I could get through the day. I could now bring all my energy to bear in swimming. I was energized and hyped for it like I hadn't been in years, and it was just like falling in love with the sport all over again. And that sort of message. I mean, so the whole book is filled with stories like that, but they're also punctuated with this other part of the story, which is that they conclude more like hers, which is challenges that they face and this sort of failure of inclusion. Um, So I don't know. I mean, part of me wants to just sort of like have a question about the importance of sport. All of you are coaches. All of you, this is one of the key themes in the book: the importance of being able to play. Uh, and so can you maybe just say something about that for people who aren't in that space? Uh, this is not just about competition, right? It's about self discovery and team building. So preach the the doctrine of sports, or the
Well, maybe I can kick us off by saying So I'm an academic, right? And there are a lot of people who don't take academics who study sport very seriously. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of people, especially in the academy, had really negative experiences in sport. So I just want to give the caveat that yes, sport can be incredible. It can be incredibly empowering. For me, it absolutely was. I cannot imagine my life without sport. And it can be incredibly harmful. So I want to start by saying that before I get into why I love sport.
When you say harmful, what do you mean by harmful?
So part of what we talk about in the book is reimagining sport. And what we talk a lot about is, first of all, I mean, if we look at the statistics in this country, girls are still twice as likely to leave sport by the age of, now it used to be 14, now it's 13, than cisgender boys. There's still fewer cisgender girls participating in sport right now in the United States than there were cisgender boys participating in sport in 1972 when Title IX was passed. We have some issues, right? There are clearly people who are welcomed and invited in sport, and there are people who are not, right? And you can just look at the statistics, it's very clear. And notably, the people who are most invited in sport are the people who have the money to pay for sport. So I want to really underscore that. But I will say, going back to the question of why sport, you know, I have no idea what it means to be a trans person in this country. I identify as cisgender. And yet, when I'm hearing that quote from Leah, I do get it. Because in my sporting experiences, sport for me as a young person was one of the few spaces where I could show up and be who I am. Mm-hmm. I could be loud, I could be aggressive, I could be fast, I could be strong, I could be unabashedly competitive. I want everybody to have a space like that. I want every kid to have a space like that. And maybe it's sport, maybe it's not sport. This is not about sports. This is about creating those spaces for kids where they feel safe, where they feel secure, where they feel like they can be who they are. That's what this is about. Mm-hmm. I went off topic there. So Ellie, Chris, why you love sport? I don't know.
Well, I'll just say, you know, as a trans person, experiencing sport gave me the cover to be more authentically myself before I transitioned. So, you know, I was raised and socialized as female. I played girls and women's sports growing up, and that opportunity on the sports team, even though I felt an incongruence in my body, even though I felt, and I didn't know how to explain that to other people at that time also. This is before I had the terminology of transgender. It's before I understood or saw any role models or a possibility for my future. Being on a team with other girls in high school was an opportunity for me to have the cover to wear baggy shorts and a hoodie and like dress a little more in a ways that felt comfortable because I was an athlete. And that title of athlete gives people a lot of space to play with their authenticity and their identity just because of the ways that sport is set up as a system. It preferences masculinity. It allows for more gender expression for any participant of sports. And it was a safe space for me in that capacity. At the same time, it felt extremely unsafe for me to be there and not be able to tell my coach really who I am and not be able to share parts of me with my teammates. But when the whistle blew, when the ball was tipped off, you know, everything else went away. And so many of the stories in the book mirror this idea that when we are in play, when our bodies are in motion, we are just people doing a thing together, working towards a common goal, or facing off against each other, but we're doing it together, and we have that shared experience. And there are very few things like that in the world that can bring people together in that way. So, I think just for everyone to have the opportunity, aside from all of the great social, physical, mental benefits that sports provide, and we know, higher levels of graduation rates, and you learn dedication and teamwork and communication skills, and all of the life skills that I appreciate about myself now came from youth sports. So those are universal, but that opportunity to be on a team with people that I never would have talked to or met outside of tryouts for volleyball, right? To be on the bus rides and connect with people whose family experiences and upbringings were completely different than mine. That's the true value of sports. Like, I don't remember my basketball record. I remember, one thing about my high school sporting experience. I was all conference in all my sports. I'll hold on to that one. I don't know my thank you. I don't know my, top scoring basketball game or anything like that. But what I do remember distinctly are those moments of connection with people. The bus rides, the long bus rides where we'd stop at some fast food restaurant and all just be gossiping on the way back, right? Or just like connecting with people, having that opportunity. And, as Dr. Baeth mentioned, we are moving farther and farther away from that. We are in this sort of like loneliness epidemic. We are not connected in the ways that we used to be. And so those sporting experiences are just so profoundly important on so many levels.
Yeah, this is a theme that also runs through the book. That's one of the things that this increasing all these sports bans are depriving those moments of connection. That this is an opportunity for trans and cis athletes to work together to kind of have a common experience, and and maybe that's part of what is scary to the forces that are pushing against it. Is that you kind of see these levels of freedom, you can see these levels of connection, um, and I think one of the other sources that you draw on near the end of the book is Heather McGhee's "The Sum of Us." Uh, right, I like that you kind of bring this in, and that kind of connects us to that intersectional lens that I think uh, all of you have mentioned so far, that there's these other identity categories like race, like class, that are also implicated here. That in a lot of ways sports mirrors, but also helps to kind of overcome or transcend. Uh, and I'm not sure if that makes it more or less dangerous, but definitely there seems to be a razor's edge that we're all walking as we participate in these activities. Um, I don't know if there's not necessarily a question there, but I do think
I
one
think
of
it
the
goes, doesn't that,
go ahead.
to me, it circles back to the scarcity versus abundance model, right? That like
Which
when
is
we
what
look,
McGee is talking about, right?
that's
That's
exactly
that sort
right.
of scarcity model.
That's
We have to get rid of all the swimming pools,
yes,
right? We're going to
yes.
get rid of all the swimming pools because black people might swim in the white swimming pools. So let's just
Well,
all get rid of them.
and unfortunately, like in our the capitalist hellscape that we're living in, we have to talk in the language of money. And McGee is saying it is economically like a disadvantage. Racism is not smart if you're looking at economics, and I think
Hmm.
that is so true when it comes to sport, is like inclusion is good for everybody. Everybody wins when everybody wins in sports. And so let's talk about creating safer sports. Let's talk about creating more fairness in sports. That's going to mean policing girl and women's bodies less to maintain this category, and really looking at what's actually happening in reality. If I can add to the sports conversation, I would echo what these two have said, and also add that sports gives a sense of belonging, and belonging is a body feel, where our vigilance can drop and we can just inhabit our bodies. And that's where we get powerful, which I think is what's scary, right? Is one of my taglines is disempowered people are easier to control. So if we get more people inhabiting their bodies and tapping into the power and exuberance and joy in their bodies in collective movement and belonging to a team, we're going to get really, really dangerous to the systems super, super fast. And that's what we want. I'm going to say that Donald Trump has also built something to belong to. And
Sure.
we're so deeply desperate to belong.
Hmm.
We have to build beautiful things to belong to that counter that. That is an alternative to that. And sports is an opportunity for that. And these bands are a barrier to where we need to go so that more bodies feel that sense of power and belonging, that collective unity. Watch out.
Well, and this, I mean, I want to sort of put this out there that, and we can kind of pick it up, but there, I know that what you just mentioned, that there is it's something to pick up on throughout the book, that the sports bans and especially sex verification processes don't actually help cisgendered men or women, right? That this is another myth you kind of debunk, and happy to sort of pick that back up, but I want to make sure we talk about the last chapter, because it seems like that's what you're talking about here. The entire book is filled with these sort of inspiring stories about what sport can do for all people, but especially transgender kids and athletes who don't find those places of belonging and don't find that sort of ease in their bodies in quite the same way. But I really appreciated this last chapter because as I was reading the book, I was sort of thinking, well, yeah, there's really a problem here, but what's the alternative, right? What else can we have? And I feel like there's such a vision that you provide there and a rationale for an end to sex segregated sport, right? And also some concrete examples where this is actually working. So, for instance, you describe this gender expansive ultimate frisbee team founded by one of your interviewees, and you say that, quote, everyone belongs so that they can drop into their bodies and play. So I want to make sure to give you all a chance to kind of talk more about what a system where sports wasn't segregated by sex, especially at the recreational level. I mean, I feel like that's almost a no-brainer. It sort of becomes ridiculous to imagine, well, why can't we just all play a game together? But say I wanted to kind of hear more about these examples, this vision of just ending sex segregation in sports in general.
I'm going to ask Ellie to talk about the flying chimichangas.
Flying chimichangas.
Absolutely. Okay. I love this. So my 11-year-old played on a fifth grade soccer team, and they named themselves the Flying Chimichangas, and it was a mixed gender soccer team. And these
Okay,
bodies are pre-puberty. Okay.
sure.
It's in a league where mixed gender teams are encouraged. They were the only mixed gender team in the league, and they were undefeated. So we went game after game after game watching this team of boys, little boys and girls, prepubescent, playing against teams of all boys and winning. And I could watch the posture in the girls' bodies on the Flying Chimichangas every single win. They're getting braver. They're like really realizing that they can hang with the boys because by fifth grade, they've already been told that they can't.
Yeah.
Right? So by the end of the season, my child, who is a boy, and this is where cis boys win too, didn't check to see who he was passing to. He passed to the open player. It didn't matter if that was a girl or a boy because they're all amazing. They're all bodies playing together and they were undefeated. So what that did to both the boys and the girls on the Flying Chimichangas at the end of the season where they were the undefeated team and they were kicking the pants of all of these all boys teams. That's where like sport is so powerful in addressing the conditioning that starts so early, I would argue, in utero. And tells girls to play small. One of the things we're challenging is that women and girls just haven't had enough time to show the world what we can do with our bodies.
Yeah.
So we need to do categories of like pre-puberty. We got to think one way. Adult recreational sport. Yes. Can we just be bodies moving together? Absolutely. And then it also depends on the sports. We tell the story of the 1992 Barcelona Games where a woman won the mixed gender clay pigeon shooting competition, and then that sport became binary by sex because a woman won it, right? So so it
Which says
also
a lot about what sex segregation is supposed to do.
that's exactly right. And
You know?
who are we
Ski jumping is the same way if you look at the history of ski jumping. Yeah,
So sort of like it's all one
tying in.
until the woman wins, and then we gotta make it safe for men to dominate again. Is that
That's exactly
basically?
right.
Yeah,
Uh,
so we have to be thinking about who are these bans really trying to protect? Are they really trying to protect cis women, which clearly it shows that it actually makes it more dangerous by implementing sex testing and invasive scrutiny of women's bodies, or is it trying to protect fragile cis male egos, right? And I would argue that that is actually a little bit more of what's happening here.
well,
And
and
and to
activating them. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and just to round that out, I think for me, it is so much more fun to think about what kids can be and what we all can be instead of being told what not to be. And when we are vilifying trans women and girls, we are very clearly saying to little boys, what you should not be is a woman. And what should not happen is that you lose a sporting competition to a woman.
Right.
That is devastating. But also, isn't it so much more fun to be like, hey, you can be whoever you want to be? Let's get imaginative. Let's just flip all of that on its head. Let's have fun.
Well, and what that example, the flying chimichangas, also sort of makes me think is that all of, even if we go to this like British medical Journal of Sports Medicine, right? I mean, all of the people that they're looking at grew up in these spaces that were socialized in a certain way. So you're not actually testing some biological capacity. You're testing, in a lot of ways, the ways that people have learned to use their bodies in that sex segregated environment, right? So even a study that shows that these differences are not that important is still infused with this environment where kids are segregated. Kids are told that they have to act in a certain way, and so that vision of a kind of ending sex segregation, especially at the prepubescent or the recreational level, this really opens up the idea of equality, and I think that's the ultimate threat, right? That's the real threat here, is that you have a system of of equality across gender, across race, across class, and that sports doesn't sit as one of the spaces where white cis upper class males can always dominate, because that's basically what sport ends up being. I think that's part of the conclusion that you reach. Maybe.
Yeah,
Um,
no, and you mentioned the socializing part. I can just speak to that quickly. So, I was raised and socialized as a young girl, and I have a cisgender brother who is 2 years younger than me, and we largely played the same sports. I felt like I was a victim of having the shadow, and as a young person,
mm,
I wanted nothing more than to have my own identity, and my brother would do everything I would do, and it was so frustrating to me. And as a child, I didn't recognize it. We would play baseball and we both go to tryouts, and the expectations of, how would you perform at tryouts? Where would you get placed on the co-ed teams? I saw through his sporting experiences and my own, I recognized this after transitioning, that the ways in which I was spoken to as a young girl who was in the same sports as my brother was very different than the coaching, instruction, and expectations that were placed on him as a young cis boy. So he was told to run through first base, to be aggressive, to be competitive, and I was told not to try that hard. I was told to like have a good time. I was more told the social benefits of just like being a part of a team and
yeah.
don't worry about winning. and not to take it so seriously. And my brother was told to take it very seriously. And so everything that you just mentioned about how, when we're socialized, like as Ellie said, it starts in utero essentially, but like the expectations of me and how I could perform and the limits to where I could go within sport and out of sport as well, the classroom included with things like STEM. I recognized through transition that I was set up to fail as a young female athlete, right? Because I was not given the tools, I was not given the coaching or instructions, and more than anything, I wasn't given the confidence or the belief. People didn't believe in me or champion me the way that they championed my brother, who was a okay little boy athlete, but I was much better. So he's great at many other things, but I think that is something that is just so important in this moment, is how we speak to young kids. This is why the Chimichanga story is so incredible, because I am picture myself being that young girl on the co-ed team, and how that would have changed my trajectory in sport and in life, the confidence that I would have gotten, the belief that I do belong, when for so long, just as a young gender nonconforming kid, I was searching for that. And as somebody who was perceived to be a young girl, I was searching for that. And I was so drawn to sports, and it seemed so close because I saw it happen for my brother, but I just couldn't get there because I was perceived to be a young girl.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That does seem to drive this all home. So end of sex segregated sports. Let's just get rid of it. I think that's a good place to go. That should be the policies we start pushing. Just
I will say, at the elite level, there obviously are guidelines, and I don't think, in the book we're not saying like throw away every policy in the entire world. That's not it. But we do need to be imaginative about how we think about the future of sport, because the things that have the studies and data do not back up, do not show that exclusion should be the way forward. So we know that much to start. And we know that these policies are coming from a political standpoint, not a scientific or academic or real world experience standpoint, right? Because again, there are handfuls of trans people, and that doesn't justify being banned, and it also doesn't justify not having any rules at all, right? So, when we're in this moment of the Olympic Games, and clearly at the very top of sports, there are going to be, and there should be, different requirements for participation when things like gold medals are on the line. Because I don't ever see us restructuring the Olympic Games to be genderless, right? Because of the things that happen, like the skeet shooting or skiing or ice skating or the other many sports where when a woman wins overall, the whole sport has to be rearranged because God forbid, right? But for 99.9% of people who are not professional athletes, who are not in the Olympics or Paralympic Games, who are seeking sporting opportunities for connection, for fun, for personal satisfaction, even for competitiveness and for winning, there are different pathways that we could imagine and enact that would be separate from what we're seeing on the Olympics, right? So I just want to be clear that we're not saying like
absolutely. Well, I think in conjunction with that, the studies that we were just talking about at the beginning, those are studies that say if an athlete has been undergoing hormone replacement therapy and gender affirming care, and so I think if there was an authentic concern about this competitive advantage that a transgender woman might have versus a cisgender woman, then the it seems the more reasonable response would be to make sure that a transgender woman has the appropriate access to transgender, gender affirming hormone replacement care, right? That would be, but the fact that those two policies are happening at the same time, to ban the care and to ban the athletes, that seems to be, that illustrates that this is not about inclusion, it's not about competitiveness, it's not about making sure that sports are fair, it's just about bigotry.
We'd also be much more concerned about the safety of trans men competing against cis men.
Yeah, you raised that point in the book. There's just sort of like, well, there's not even a policy there. If you were going to be really concerned, then maybe you would look at these two differences, making comparison about the safety of trans men playing on men's teams. Yeah. Well, I know that you all have other events to go to, and I really appreciate you spending this time with us today. I especially appreciate the work that you've done on this book. I do wish that it was out like 7 years ago, but I'll take it today. I thank you all for joining us, and I recommend everyone check the book out. Recommend it to your senators, your representatives, your sports coaches, and associations. And if someone could send a copy to Gavin Newsom as well, he definitely needs a copy. uh, so thank you all. This episode will be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel, the recording. So please share it with your friends and colleagues, and let us know if you have any ideas for future episodes by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. Again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com. Until next time, take care, and thanks again to all of you.
Thanks so much.